Meat alternatives like quorn, tofu, and Beyond Burgers claim to have a lower environmental impact than beef, pork, and chicken. But is that actually the case? In this video, I'm going to do some cooking and find out. With thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Today, we feed over 8 billion people. Not fairly, and certainly not sustainably, but we do feed them. By the end of the century, however, we will likely need to feed around 10 billion people, and we've got to do that sustainably, or we won't be doing it for long. That means doing so without degrading our soils, dumping excess nutrients into our water systems, or dumping excess carbon into our atmosphere. Globally, agriculture is responsible for around 1/5 of all greenhouse gas emissions. Here in Europe specifically, it's more like 10%, a little over 10%. Regardless, this is a big deal. We're talking about a lot of emissions. If you're wondering how agriculture could produce carbon emissions, because surely crops draw carbon out of the atmosphere, right? Well, it comes down to everything else you do on the farm. Applying fertilizer to fields, running farm machinery, microbes in rice paddies, and famously burping cows all produce emissions, which can outweigh the drawdown by the crops themselves. Farming practices determine how large emissions are from growing food, a point we'll come back to. And you've seen the title of this video, you know where this is going. Here in Europe specifically, animal agriculture constitutes almost 70% of all the emissions from agriculture. Decarbonising agriculture can largely be interpreted to mean reducing emissions from meat and animal products like cheese. Hey. But before we talk about how we do that, it's important to ask a question, which is, why do people eat meat and animal products in the first place? Well, the answer's obvious, because it tastes good. Or at least it can. But also, people eat meat and cheese and other animal products to get a key part of their diet: protein.
Globally, around 40% of our protein comes from animal-based foods. So that's meat, dairy, fish. The other 60% comes from plant proteins. So that's cereals, legumes such as peas and beans, and other, plant proteins. This is Dr. Hannah Ritchie, the co-editor of Our World in Data that you've seen a lot of on this channel, and researcher at the University of Oxford who wrote a PhD thesis on the environmental impacts of food. If you just plot, animal protein consumption against GDP or incomes, you see a really, really strong relationship where richer countries tend to get much more of the protein from animal sources. So I think in the US, for example, I think around 70% of protein comes from animal-based foods. I think in the UK it's maybe 60%. But if you contrast that with lower income countries, so Bangladesh, for example, I think is 20% animal protein. Yeah, I think if we're going to go on a business as usual trajectory, these countries will get richer, and we should want them to get richer because they're moving out of poverty. That is undeniably a good thing. But it will mean that our overall protein demand will go up, and our demand for animal protein will go up. So if you just go on this business as usual trajectory, you would assume that meat, dairy, animal product consumption will go up this century.
Now, there's a whole debate we could get into here about how much protein a person actually needs per day. That is a surprising mess in the medical literature. I'm going to put that to one side and instead just ask the question, how damaging is that increase in the demand for protein going to be? Well, let's compare how damaging different sources of protein are to the environment. And I'm going to do that by considering two key metrics: greenhouse gas emissions and land used per gram of protein produced. Now, greenhouse gas emissions, pretty self-explanatory. Land use is important because it's a finite resource. And if you're using land to grow food, then you're not using it for other purposes, like forests, afforestation, or, I don't know, letting the rest of nature have a shot? This impressive paper from 2018 estimates the total greenhouse gas emissions and land used per 100 grams of protein produced on around 38,000 different farms around the world. It finds that beef grown for meat has the largest carbon footprint, around 50 kilos for each 100 grams of beef protein, followed by lamb, then beef grown in a dairy herd. Cheese, pork, and poultry have much lower impacts. It's worth noting, by the way, that these numbers are purely the carbon carbon cost of growing the protein. It doesn't account for other factors in the supply chain, like, for example, land use change, cutting down forests to make room for beef pasture, for example, but also the cost of animal feed, the carbon cost of transporting the food and processing the food. If you do account for greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of finished food across the entire supply chain, then the results look like this. The same conclusions, just with everything shifted. The picture in land use is a little different. Both beef and lamb take up large quantities of land per gram of protein produced, with cheese, pork and beef grown in a dairy herd using roughly equal amounts. Poultry uses significantly less land per gram of protein. It's important to note though that those numbers are just the averages.
Beef, can have a 3 to 10 times higher carbon footprint per gram of protein compared to chicken. So actually, if someone was eating a lot of beef, just not changing the amount of meat they're eating, but substituting the type of meat would make a big difference to their carbon footprint. But you'll notice that I said 3 to 10 times there, which are a really wide range. So if you take the example of beef, the mean or median greenhouse gas impact is around 50 kilograms of greenhouse gases per 100 grams of protein production. That varies, that's the mean, but that varies from 20 to more than 100. And this was in a big meta-analysis of, I think, nearly 40,000 different farms of different products. And that really stems from just different farming systems around the world, where it's been produced, especially land use, what has been displaced to produce that beef. So much as there is variance in the impact of animal products on the environment, we have a baseline. We know roughly how much carbon will be emitted into the atmosphere by our food systems if business continues as usual. The answer being a lot, per gram of protein and overall. So, how does fake meat compare? In front of me, I have examples of all the major types of meat substitute. So let's go through them. First up, a classic, tofu. Tofu literally means bean curd in Chinese. It's made from soy milk that you allow to coagulate and press into curds. It's literally just cheese that you make from soy milk instead of dairy. Incidentally, if you'd like to make a nice vegan mince, crumble a load of tofu into a bowl and then mix in some oil, salt, pepper, paprika and a load of soy sauce and roast in the oven for 10 minutes at 180 degrees. That's not got anything to do with the rest of this video. That's just a recipe I really like. This is my favorite vegan mince. Per the 2018 paper, to create 100 grams of protein in tofu, on average, causes the emission of 2 kilograms of CO2 emissions, and 3.2 kilograms for each kilogram of end product. And the land use is similarly low, on average 2.2 square meters for every 100 grams of protein, or 3.5 square meters for each kilo of tofu. Next, tempeh. This is also made from soy, but the beans rather than the milk. You soak and partially cook the beans, then ferment them using a fungus. The result is a nutty, firm texture that you can use to replace chicken. Personally, I like to mix it with tofu in recipes just to give it a bit of variety. If I'm honest, I think I prefer tofu, but actually, it's pretty good. Tempeh isn't mentioned in the 2018 paper, but I did find an estimate of its carbon intensity of 2.5 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions for every kilo of finished product, which, considering that it is so similar to tofu, is what I'd expect, but no land use data. And lastly, for the traditional meat substitutes, seitan. Seitan? One of them. I couldn't find one of these in my local supermarket. Could you just put one in my hand, Luke? Cheers. This isn't made from soy, but wheat. You take a wheat flour dough, wash all the starch out of it, and then the glutinous mass that remains is seitan, which incidentally probably comes from raw protein in Japanese, but we're actually not sure. It also wasn't mentioned in the 2018 paper, but I did find 2 independent estimates of its carbon intensity, which were both around half a kilo of greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of finished product. Again, no land use data. It's pretty clear then that tofu and tempeh and seitan, imagine there's some here, have significantly lower impact on the environment than beef, and moderately lower impacts than pork, poultry and mutton in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and land use. Though the error bars indicate that the most unsustainably produced tofu, in particular, would have a higher carbon intensity than the most sustainably produced chicken. But for most comparisons, it would be the other way around, and we'll come back to this point later. However, these two, and seitan, are meat substitutes, but not fake meat. They're not trying to look or taste like chicken, for example. Let's now look at some products that are. First up, mycoprotein. This is quorn, which is made from fungi brewed in vast containers of a
a sugar solution derived from wheat, which means it's technically not plant-based, it's fungus. After 4 days of fermentation, it's harvested and then frozen, which allows long chains of mycoprotein to develop, and then it's processed into different meats. This is beef mince, for example. Normally, you wouldn't cook it like this. You'd cook it with a sauce. I haven't for the sake of this video, which is just as well because you don't really want your food to look like cat food. So as I say, this is beef, but you can also get chicken, turkey, fish, pork. Wait a minute. Can I get a receipt for that, please? Quorn is the meat in the famous Greggs vegan sausage roll. If you're not from the UK, this thing is like an institution. That's a business expense. Not many life cycle analyses have been conducted on this kind of precision fermentation. The Carbon Trust completed a report in 2022 that examined the carbon footprint of different corn types with typical meats in different countries, and found that corn was much lower impact, though not quite as low as tofu, and a pretty similar story in land use. Though this is only one study, and I do note that it has been uploaded to the Quorn website. And lastly, I've grouped these two together for reasons that will become clear: pea protein and soy protein. Pea protein is especially commonly used in combination with soy-based proteins and is used in the famous Beyond Meat burgers. To make it, you clean and dehull green and yellow split peas in an alkaline solution and then separate out the protein using a hydrocyclone. Awesome. You then extrude the protein and add various ingredients like saturated fat to emulate the mouthfeel of actual meat. And I've got to say, out of all the options, I think this is the most convincing by far as actual meat. Oh yeah. I mean, that is indistinguishable from like your typical beef burger. Though I will say that soy protein is actually not far behind. This is my favorite fake chicken, for example. As you can probably imagine, by the way, it's made from soybeans. The Good Food Institute has compiled various studies on the life cycle emissions and land use of several pea and soy-based proteins and found significant reductions in emissions and land use compared to traditional meat. Beyond Meat have this impressive life cycle analysis, claiming their burgers reduce carbon emissions by 90% and land and water use by 97% compared to beef patties, and this study compared plant-based beef patties to those grown in Brazil and Ireland and found similar results. So by our two metrics, fake meat is definitely lower impact on the environment than regular meat, though not as low impact as meat alternatives like tofu and tempeh. It's also worth stressing that the difference between plant-based beef and beef is the largest. The difference between plant-based pork and plant-based chicken and the meat originals is smaller, but still measurable. And for the record, we also could have considered water pollution, water use, and soil acidification, and found similar results from the 2018 paper and other sources. Meat alternatives being significantly less damaging per kilo of finished product and per gram of protein than meat to the environment. And going forwards, the emissions difference is only going to be more stark. That's because plant-based proteins have emissions that largely come from how they are processed. In other words, they have an energy cost rather than a biological cost. And so as energy is increasingly decarbonized, the emissions difference between animal products and equivalent plant-based products will grow. But to repeat a point I mentioned earlier, all of these numbers are just averages. In truth, there will be a range of environmental impacts associated with each kilo of meat alternative produced, depending on the specific producer, just as it was with meat. You could, as a consumer, reduce your impact by buying, for example, more sustainably produced beef, going from, say, here in terms of your impact to here per gram of protein. But two things. Firstly, generally speaking, the more intensely a meat is farmed, battery chickens compared to free range, for example, the lower the carbon intensity of the meat. Those bumps in the distribution for chicken, pork, and eggs, those are battery farmed animals. So while that's good by one metric, it's bad by another: animal welfare. And much as I'm not going to make a moral case for vegetarian or veganism in this video, I do think that animal welfare should be a factor in how you decide which foods to buy. And secondly, even buying the most sustainably produced source of beef available to you is very unlikely to minimize your impact per gram of protein you consume.
No, I think the shift to meat substitutes will have a higher environmental impact than eating a more sustainable form of beef, for example. To be clear, I think we need to do both. I don't think this is an either or, but I think the best case scenario from a climate perspective is that you would substitute with a meat substitute or a plant-based protein, rather than just slightly improving the efficiency of agriculture, animal agriculture.
Okay, but you may have heard all of that and thought, yeah, but it's not meat, is it? And yeah, I'm sure that if you'd never had these before, you could probably tell the difference between a beef burger and chicken and these. They don't taste exactly the same or feel exactly the same in the mouth. But what if we could get the best of both worlds? A food that tastes and feels exactly the same as meat, but that was produced using energy rather than farmland. What about lab-grown meat? Lab-grown meat isn't really fake meat at all, because it's literally meat. You take a sample of cells from an animal and then cultivate that, basically make the cells multiply, in a medium made of nutrients, hormones, and amino acids, with the result being a formless muscle soup. You can make it like a steak, for example, by also cultivating fats and connective tissue and then combining them either on a structure or through 3D printing, which is pretty awesome. This gives you literally the same end product as a piece of animal grown the old-fashioned way. It's not vegetarian because it's meat, just made without the messy feels and animal stuff. It uses far less land for obvious reasons, contributes far less to soil and water pollution, and is expected to produce far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than conventional meat. It sounds perfect, but let me take you out of this video for just a moment. This video was originally called How Green is Lab-Grown Meat, actually. And it was chosen by my patrons over on patreon.com/SimonOxFizz. Patrons get early access to videos, exclusive content every month, and vote on a video topic a month. Those patrons voted for How Green is Lab-Grown Meat, actually, specifically. These names on screen, by the way, these are my executive producer, Henry Cavill and Steven Spielberg patrons. Massively appreciate your support. Thank you, guys. But when I started researching that video, I hit a bit of a snag because there just wasn't that much data available, even when I went to the source. Wikipedia has a table of startups that are making lab-grown meat, which I went through and identified 8 companies that seem to be nearing commercial production. And I emailed all of those companies asking for a sample of their product, which, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and for an environmental assessment or a carbon intensity of their product specifically. Now, only 2 companies replied to me, and neither of those could supply a sample or an environmental assessment or carbon intensity. And as far as I could tell, only one company's website had that information, which was for Sci-Fi Foods, who estimated that their plant-based burger produced 87% less emissions than a typical beef burger, which was a peer-reviewed study. Apparently this was a world-first assessment for such lab-grown meat. And in fact, you may have clocked that earlier I said that lab-grown meat is expected to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The figures that some companies point to came from this paper published last year, which took real data from companies active in the space and their expected production levels in 2030. This is an example of an ex-ante study, effectively a forecast, which says lab-grown beef should be much lower carbon than beef, about the same carbon intensity as chicken, interestingly, and moderately lower carbon than pork. And I want to be clear, I'm not criticizing the study, it seems to be a fine piece of work. I bring it up, and the other specific study, because they demonstrate how nascent the field of lab-grown or cultivated meat is. We don't know how green this stuff is because we haven't worked out how we can make it commercially yet. In fact, there are several academics who seriously question whether lab-grown meat could ever be economically viable at scale, and accuse the industry of being a classic Silicon Valley venture, a flashy, high-tech, ultra-capitalist solution to the climate crisis, saying, hey, invest in us and our shiny new technology and we'll fix the climate crisis. And you can keep eating steak. You can certainly see the impact of that investment on these companies' websites. They are very flashy, distracting you from how vague their claims are. Of course, that's not unique to lab-grown meat. Plant-based meat companies, like Beyond Meat, have been the subject of controversies and even lawsuits, and generally accusations that they are an investment bubble that can't possibly deliver on their promises to decarbonize our food. But trying to view any one class of meat substitute imagine there's some lab-grown meat down here, as the solution is missing the point. Each class has a different role to play. Lab-grown meat is expensive. Swiss company Marais Foods, for example, produces premium steaks that cost, quote, a small car per kilogram. And sure, that cost will probably come down with time, but it's probably always going to be expensive. And that's not a problem if you're replacing premium meat consumption in rich countries. But it's not going to provide protein to people being lifted out of poverty. I see mycoproteins in particular, and to a lesser extent pea and soy-based proteins, as replacing meat consumption for the majority of green-minded consumers in rich countries, and maybe to a certain extent replacing meat consumption in people in lower income countries. This, I think, is where the majority of the reduction in meat consumption will happen, with meat substitutes like tofu and tempeh and seitan filling in some of the gaps between these two and being a cheaper alternative. To answer the question of this video, these are all green. They all produce fewer greenhouse gas emissions per gram of protein and per gram of end product than meat. On average, they take less land to produce and they contribute less to other environmental risks like water pollution. For all of them, the largest difference is relative to beef, and the smallest difference is relative to chicken, though that difference is still measurable. If it purely came down to carbon emissions, then the greenest option is definitely down this end, and eating more of the raw products that make up these processed foods, peas, beans, and lentils. Relative to this, and those raw ingredients, fake meat isn't all of that green. But it all comes down to practicalities. As I mentioned a couple of videos ago now, climate realpolitik. The greenest solution is the one that can actually be implemented. I like this quote from Elliot Swartz of the Good Food Institute. People have long been educated about the negative impacts of animal agriculture, yet the percentage of vegans and vegetarians remains relatively low. Instead of forcing people to change their behavior, we believe it will be more effective to offer substitutes that seamlessly integrate into their diets without requiring a behavioral shift. In other words, substituting your beef burger with a plant-based burger is green. So is replacing your beef burger with a tofu burger. More green, in fact. But which one of those two would you actually do? This century, we will need to feed 10 billion people. And we'll need to make sure those people get enough protein. But we also need to reduce our emissions from meat and animal products. What I hope you've seen over the course of this video is that this can be done, and that replacing meat with meat substitutes is a viable, and I think necessary, strategy.
Now, that doesn't mean everyone going fully vegan. Someone in a low-income country that eats a few kilograms of meat a year reducing their meat consumption. That's not what that means. That means the people eating 80, 90, 100 kilograms a year significantly reducing consumption. And we would need to see globally a reduction in meat consumption. Realistically, that's never going to happen overnight, and we're not going to get to really low levels of meat consumption very, very quickly. So we do need to combine that with implementing or going for more sustainable ways of producing the meat that we do eat. And combining those two, you could actually have a really significant impact on carbon emissions, but also the other, what we define as boundaries, like water pollution, land use, water use. So I think those two combined will have a significant impact.
Now, Hannah goes on here to talk about two more key strategies for decarbonising agriculture and simultaneously making it more resilient to climate change. But seeing as I messed over my patrons because I didn't technically make the video they voted for, I want to say sorry by making that as an extra video just available on my Patreon. 38,000 farms worth of data went into this paper. Unless you're a Mentat from June, you're not going to be able to do that kind of analysis in your head. That's pretty typical of global problems like agriculture, energy, disease management. The kind of stuff that Dr. Ritchie makes her excellent graphics about. It's safe to say that you cannot find solutions to problems like this without a data-driven approach. But that's also true for your personal finances, setting goals, and managing your time. In fact, the ability to analyze and interpret large amounts of data is one of the most valuable skills we can learn. And yet, most of us don't get taught it at all. Fortunately, there is a free, fun, and easy way to learn about data science. And that is with this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing. They offer highly interactive courses in maths, science, and data science comprising of thousands of lessons. If you'd like to learn more about data analysis, you can take their beginner and intermediate courses in probability, modelling, random variables, and much more. By learning first principles, you are almost immediately able to play with the subject matter through interactive exercises designed by an award-winning team of researchers and professionals from MIT, Microsoft, and Google. I've been privileged to work with Brilliant for many years now, something I'm delighted to do because they're the resource I wish I had when I was a student. And every time I make one of these ad reads, there's something new. There's new courses, there's new artwork, there's new exercises. It just keeps getting better. And it was pretty great to begin with. Learning a little every day is a really great habit to get into. And when you can learn problem-solving skills, critical thinking skills, and data literacy, it's a massive boon to your employability and, frankly, your life. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Simon Clark or click the link in the description, where you'll also get a 20% off an annual subscription. That link again, brilliant.org/Simon Clark. With thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video and for being, well, great. Thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you, of course, to Dr. Hannah Ritchie for coming on the channel. I've been a fan of Hannah's work for a long time now at Our World in Data. I use her work all the time, so it's kind of a dream come true having her on the channel. Thank you very much, Hannah, for coming on. And if you enjoyed the video, please do the YouTube pleasantries, leave a like, leave a comment, share it with people who you think may find it interesting. And if you'd like to watch something else from me next, then here's 2 videos I prepared earlier. That just leaves me to say thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.